Between early 1957 and early 1958, nuclear tensions between the Western and Eastern blocs were rising high. In May of 1957, the UK had tested its first hydrogen bomb. In November, Nikita Khrushchev was claiming Soviet nuclear superiority in the wake of the launch of Sputnik 2. Headlines back then, and book chapters today, covered in great detail those events. But over the same period, an almost forgotten calamity caused more than 1 million deaths worldwide. It was an event that spurred panic in the scientific community and debates about contagion, prevention, and immunization. If you're watching this video in 2021, this should all sound familiar, as I'm talking about a pandemic likely originating in China. Not the one we're living in today, but one that swept the globe at the height of the Cold War. I'm your host David, and today we will explore the Asian flu pandemic of 1957 and 1958, and specifically how the US and the USSR responded to it, and how the tensions between warring blocs influenced its course and the roots of contagion. This is the Cold War. The corporate world is getting ever more competitive, but fear not, the sponsor of this video, DataCamp, is here to help you stay on course and improve. DataCamp is an online learning platform that makes it easy to build your data analytical skills and allows you, through its incredibly interactive courses and hands-on exercises, to improve your knowledge at your own pace. And the best thing? You don't need any previous experience, as DataCamp has courses for everyone and at every difficulty level. You can start with something as simple as the basics of Microsoft Excel and continue developing until you get into something more lucrative like machine learning or Python. Take the Data Science for Business course as an example. It's simple yet deep and teaches you everything you need to know on how to use your available data to improve your business. You can learn directly from your browser. DataCamp doesn't require any additional software. Subscriptions start at $25 a month, and there is no credit card required at sign-up. Advance your professional career and build new skills. Stand out from your peers with in-depth data and analytical skills. Invest in yourself. Use my link in the description and check out the first chapter of any course for free. The flu outbreak was first reported in 1957, first in February in Singapore and then in April in Hong Kong, but it had likely originated some months earlier in mainland China. Within a matter of months, this virus spread first to the Soviet Union, then to India, Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. From Japan, the virus hopped over the Pacific Ocean and into the United States. The pandemic then moved into South America and across the pond. The Atlantic Ocean, that is. The UK was the first European nation to be affected, but soon the whole continent was suffering from what amounted to be a two-pronged attack. Traveling from the Soviet Union, the flu virus had moved westwards into Eastern Europe. In general, the pandemic followed a pattern of 3 waves. The first wave lasting until midsummer of 1957, the second and worst wave in the autumn of 1957, and a third, milder outbreak in the first quarter of 1958. Already during the first wave, researchers in the US, UK, and Australia, and the Soviet Union were able to isolate and analyze the virus. They found out that this flu was related to, but different from the common A1 strains of seasonal flus observed in the past decade. This was a new, deadlier strain classed as H2N2 subtype. This subtype had probably originated as an avian virus, that is, one that affects bird populations, before moving into swine hosts and finally humans. By the early months of 1958, the now dubbed Asian flu had swept the globe, infecting an estimated 900 million people, 1/3 of the world's population at that time. The death toll has been evaluated around 1.1 million people. As is the case with many flu pandemics, the demographics of infected patients followed a U-shape. This means a higher incidence of infection was recorded amongst very young children and among the elderly. However, as we can learn from an official Soviet report, the population of the so-called productive age were also badly affected. The pandemic was first recorded in the USSR in early May of 1957, when an increased morbidity rate from flu was observed in Tashkent, as well as other Central Asian cities. According to the analysis of the Soviet Deputy Minister of Health, Professor Zhdanov, the infection followed foreign visitors from neighboring countries. From Central Asia, the flu spread in two directions. Traveling along the Trans-Siberian Railway, it reached Siberia by late May. Then, traveling westwards, it hit Moscow and Leningrad by early June. After a decrease in cases over the summer, the whole of the USSR was swept by the second wave in September and October, reaching a morbidity peak in October. Infection rates then went through a lull before rising again slightly for the last time in the first quarter of 1958. The highest mortality rate from influenza and comorbid pneumonia occurred during the October-November period. During the 2 months of the second wave, the mortality rate reported in urban centers was 12 per 100,000 inhabitants. In the countryside, it was between 7 and 8 per 100,000. So, the population of the USSR in 1957 was about 203 million, which would place the total death toll then between 16 and 24,000 people. Sadly, the highest fatality rates were amongst children up to 2 years of age. In Leningrad, for example, the mortality among babies and toddlers was 12 times as high as among persons aged 16 and over. Now, in addition to just the mortality rate, we should also consider the morbidity rate. That's how many people got ill but survived. Going back to Leningrad, the October wave affected 27% of all citizens, and 40% of children up to the age of 15, who suffered with complications ranging from diarrhea and vomiting to severe otitis and pneumonia. And, like any illness, the impact could be measured beyond mortality and morbidity. The spread of the disease badly affected productivity as well. In Leningrad, 23% of those considered to be of a productive age were put out of action by the flu symptoms. Productive workers in other cities, like Kaunas in Lithuania, suffered even more, with 35% of them laid low by the pandemic. Soviet health authorities did not sit idly by, of course. Already during the first wave in May and June, the Ivanovsky Virological Institute of the USSR Academy of Medical Sciences and the Mechnikov Vaccine and Serum Institute in Moscow had isolated the new flu strain. As they were expecting a second, more virulent wave, they set to work to develop a vaccine. The plan was to produce millions of doses to inoculate first the workers in the medical services, trade, and transport, followed then by industrial and office workers. Racing against time, the Ivanovsky Institute succeeded in developing and testing a vaccine by the end of July, which the Mechnikov Institute began manufacturing in August. The immunogenic properties of the vaccine were described by Professor Zhdanov as fully satisfactory. This vaccine was also considered safe, as the incidence of adverse reactions was only 4%. From October to December, 10 million doses were dispatched across the country, and more than 3 million people were inoculated. The morbidity rate among the communities receiving the vaccine was roughly 2 to 4 times lower than the national average. In addition to the immunization campaign, the Soviet government deployed standard public health measures: quarantines, early isolation of infected individuals, and a massive communication campaign which included placards, posters, and ads on radio, TV, and cinema screens. Now, Soviet health institutions were not the only ones working on a vaccine. A similar race against the clock took place in the United States. The first case of Asian flu in the United States was reported on the Pacific coast in June 1957. By July, the virus had reached Tangipahoa Parish, Louisiana. Here, schools had reopened much earlier than elsewhere on the 12th of that month. By August, 41.5% of children had contracted the virus. This was an early omen of what was to happen in the rest of the country, with schools set to open after summer vacation in September. As autumn set in, the outbreak exploded, reaching a mortality peak in late October. Some fulminant deaths, meaning severe and sudden, were reported in healthy young adults, particularly pregnant women, but as I mentioned earlier, the laws of the U-shape applied. Young children and the elderly were the primary victims. It could have gotten much worse, but fortunately, science was already at work. Back on the 17th of April, the New York Times had published an article about the severity of the flu epidemic in Hong Kong. A man in Washington read the news report and immediately exclaimed, "My God, this is the pandemic, it's here." That man knew what he was talking about. And who was he? Well, he was Maurice Hilleman, a virologist at the Walter Reed Army Medical Research Institute. As a young doctoral student, he had proved that chlamydia was a bacteria, not a virus. And while at Walter Reed, he had demonstrated that influenza viruses undergo mutations, changing into new strains which enable them to defeat previously developed antibodies. I'll leave it to your imaginations why a virologist at an army medical center was working on chlamydia. Hilleman, suspecting that Hong Kong flu may be a new strain, mobilized the military to get a sample of the virus. In May, Hilleman received some gargled salt water from an ill sailor who had been to Hong Kong. His research confirmed his suspicions. This was indeed a new strain. If contagion reached the US, he knew many people could fall ill and many would die. As the calendar pages flipped towards June, Hilleman frantically set to work. To produce a vaccine, he had to infect batch after batch of chicken embryo cells to make the virus less dangerous to humans. Then, he provided the experimental vaccine to his network of contacts in pharmaceutical laboratories, asking them to develop millions of doses. When the Asian flu hit its peak in October, 40 million doses of the Hilleman vaccine were ready for distribution. As was the case with the Soviet vaccine, timely distribution was a problem, and certain categories of people had to be prioritized. The Asian flu exacted a heavy toll on American citizens, with a reported 116,000 people dying of the virus. Nonetheless, the Surgeon General, Leonard Burney, estimated that morbidity and mortality numbers could have been much higher had there been no vaccine. The US military awarded Hilleman a Distinguished Service Medal for his work. Now, as a quick note regarding the numbers we've used, as a result of a wide variety of international reporting mechanisms, standards, and methods, the estimated global death toll is reported by the Center for Disease Control at an estimated 1.1 million people from the most recent research on the matter, published in 2016. However, a paper by Yoneyama and Krishnamoorthy, which we are about to quote from and published in 2010 in the Journal of Infectious Diseases, uses World Health Organization numbers from 2005, which roughly doubles the death toll. We used the more recent data from the CDC, but the 2005 article illustrates well the possible spread of the virus. We just wanted to explain the discrepancy in numbers for those of you who are fact-checking. So, now we can consider how the Cold War played its role in the spread of the 1958 Asian flu. The Cold War was an age of rivalry, not cooperation, and as with any war, its dynamics and mobility were bound to influence the spread of any infectious disease. Think about the Black Death possibly riding alongside the Mongol cavalry from Central Asia to the Black Sea, and from there, sailing with the Genoese Navy to Europe. In more recent times, concentrations of troops, demobilization of army units, and even victory parades facilitated outbreaks of the so-called Spanish flu, which caused anywhere between 50 and 100 million deaths worldwide from 1918 to 1920. The Cold War did have an impact on the contagion routes of the Asian flu, albeit a different one from the examples I just made. Infectious diseases are carried not only by armies on the march, but also by trade routes via rail, ship, and air. In 1957, trade routes across warring blocs were obviously disrupted, limited, possibly even next to non-existent. How did this state of affairs shape the progress of the Asian flu? Well, Professor Krishnamoorthy and Dr. Yoneyama at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute of Troy, New York, published a paper in May of 2010 answering just this question. The authors run two simulations. What if trade routes in 1957 would have reverted back to the patterns observed in 1950 before China severed trade ties with the United States, and then in 1936 before the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War? Both simulations show that the flu would have spread to the Western Bloc countries much earlier, much faster, exacting a higher death toll. To give you a couple of examples, in the simulated 1950 scenario, Australia would have topped the casualty charts, suffering twice as many deaths as it did in the real world. In the simulated 1936, Italy would have suffered the most, experiencing 3 times as many casualties. If we look at the Eastern Bloc, however, the results are the opposite. In the 1950 simulation, East Germany would have recorded hardly any deaths. In the 1936 parallel timeline, the death rate in Poland and Romania would have been almost 0. If we look at the death toll worldwide, both simulations show that there would have been a higher death toll in a world where the Cold War never took place. In the 1936-like scenario, there could have been up to 2.1 million deaths, almost double the mortality than in the real world. So that being said, consider what could have happened if Walter Reed and the Ivanovsky Institutes had collaborated. Maybe both the USSR and the US would have been able to deploy a vaccine much earlier and in greater quantities, saving the lives of so many more. The key conclusion for us is that the particular nature of the Cold War as an ideological conflict played a vital role in curbing the morbidity and mortality rates worldwide, and particularly in the Western nations, due to the nature and direction of trade and travel prevalent at the time. On the other hand, those close trade ties that existed between China, the USSR, and Eastern Europe led to higher incidence in those countries. In case you want more details, we will post a link to the papers by Krishnamoorthy and Yoneyama in the description below, as well as to other scientific publications on the 1957 pandemic. We hope these will help in shedding some light on our own current situation. We hope that you have enjoyed today's episode, and my thanks to Philibert and Amaxandros G. Aslanian for his work in putting this episode together. To make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have vaccinated the bell button and gone back for the appropriate booster within the appropriate time frame. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We talked flu today, but this is the Cold War channel. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.